And now to our first topic of discussion to start the week. Analysts say the recent 400 basis points increase, that's for MPR, to 22.75%. In Nigeria's monetary policy rate marks progress in the country's efforts to contain inflation and support a more market-determined exchange rate. But real rates may remain negative, and the exchange rate subject to downward pressure. Well, mixed reactions have continued to trail this move by the Apex Bank. But let's put this into perspective and further understand the implication of this hike in rates. The founder and chief consultant at B. Adedipe Associates Limited, Dr. Biodo Adedipe, joins me via Zoom to talk more about this. Good afternoon, Dr. Adedipe. It's good to have you this Monday afternoon.
Thank you very much, Tolu. A very good afternoon to you. I'm happy to be with you today.
Thank you. Now, you have the figures. I know that clearly. 22.75% is where MPR sits at the moment. Asymmetric corridor is also at plus 100 basis points and minus 700 basis points. Earlier, it was plus 100 and minus 300 basis points. Now, CRR is also at 45%. Now, let me ask you, many are saying that this would obviously hurt the real economy. What is your understanding of this while the CBN tries to tackle inflation on the other side?
All right, thank you so very much. It's always good to put issues in proper perspective. And I would like to start from what normally anyone in charge of managing national economy, or even sub-national, would be concerned with. We call them the major macroeconomic objectives. Certainly, you want your economy to grow in an inclusive and sustainable manner. You want inflation rate to also be moderate, in which case it is not too high as to become a problem for every other major economic decision. I don't want it to also be so low that it brings a threat of turning into deflation that can also lead to the contraction of productivity. Now, a third major issue is full factor employment, as we put it, which means beyond labor and capital, which are primary factors of production, we want to ensure that every factor available, including intelligence, is also fully employed. Of course, one viable balance of payments, which of course relates to the issue you just mentioned on our balance of trade position at the end of 2023. Then, of course, you want at the end of the day to achieve what I describe as rapid and sustained development. Now, three key words have crossed what I said now. We want to grow the economy inclusively, you want to grow it in a sustainable manner, and you want to grow it in a sustained manner. Now, that is your overall objective. So there's also what we call the primordial trade-off between growth and inflation. And what this means essentially for you as a policymaker is that when you choose to give a lot more attention to growth, it will usually be at the expense of prices. Because when you grow your economy, of course, inflation rate has a tendency to also rise along with a growing economy. So in which case, there's a trade-off there. If you also choose to focus more on inflation, then the trade-off is that you are unlikely to get growth at a rate that you aspire or expect to achieve. So that's why we call it trade-off. But the real challenge before any policymaker is which of these two represents the most fundamental problem our economy faces at this point in time. And that brings me now fully to the decision of the Monetary Policy Committee, raising the monetary policy rate by 400 basis points from 18.75 to 22.75. Now, if you look back at the trends of our inflation rate in Nigeria, it's been trending up steadily. And then you see the gap between the MPR and inflation rate ranging between 4, 5, 6%. But when you look at the data from August 2023, it has been climbing steadily. And then the gap also increasing and widening. But we got to, as at January this year, a gap of 11.15%. Now, for me, therefore, as an analyst, and I saw this 6 months ago, that was September last year, when inflation rate started climbing, MPR remained the same. In my own opinion then, as an analyst, I said, if I were the central bank governor, or let's even come down a little bit, if I were a member of the Monetary Policy Committee, what would be of concern to me? That will go back to the triggers of the inflationary pressures we have. What are the triggers? Primarily in Nigeria, the triggers of inflation are the exchange value of the naira that has been proven by data over decades. So that is given. But also food inflation, very critical, which of course started taking a new dimension since 2017, that's 7 years ago. And now, not only that, you now say behind food itself, the food inflation, what are the drivers? Insecurity is one. The other side is poor agricultural infrastructure, where about 60% estimated of harvest goes into loss every post-harvest season in Nigeria. So that means we know where the pressure is coming from. Now, on top of that is energy prices. That is inflation driven by energy prices as we remove fuel subsidy. And of course, pricing of refined petroleum products now took on what the market dictated. So when you put all of this together, we see where inflationary pressures are coming from. Will there be a change in that immediately? No. And that brings into conversation. What are the different dimensions to this inflation? The current one, yes, latest data for January, 29.9% inflation rate. Of course, we then say, okay, what is expected inflation? In which case, if it has been trending that way, what do we expect to happen? Different analysts have made different projections. Some projected as high as 40%. I don't belong to that class. Okay, some project, some 30-something%. But some of us feel that as some changes are taking place within the milieu of economic factors in Nigeria, we may see that drop towards the end of the year. So some also have that expectation. But then comes the issue of projections. What do we project? What do we expect? What is the current level? So when you look at all of this, they point to the fact that the emergency Nigerian economy is facing right now is inflation. So if we unite around that understanding, that means ticking up the MPR will be a natural phenomenon, which of course would take us back to what we adopted in Nigeria in 2007, because I was a part of that conversation. We call it in central banking inflation targeting, which means the central bank of Nigeria will begin to pay more attention to inflation as an outcome of macroeconomic index that they need to focus on. Now we see clearly the MPC saying this, the outcome of their meeting, that's the communique, that CBN is returning to inflation targeting, all right? Which means the focus will be on what do we need to do to put inflation under control. Now, coming to the central issue of your question, and when I make that comment, I will stop so that we can take other issues as well. Now, what will be the implication for the real sector? The reality that we face is that the inflationary pressures and the trend we have is not even working the best interest of the real sector to start with. And why do I say that? From two perspectives primarily. One is if inflation rate keeps going up, then your cost of doing business will keep increasing. Now, if your cost of doing business keeps increasing, it means there will necessarily be a pass-through to your selling prices. But if now your consumers resist your high price, which is already happening anyway, then the demand for your products will also dampen. If the demand dampens, that means if inflation is not brought under check, then you have a tenuous future as a manufacturer. That we also need to understand. So if we see from that perspective, then the question will be, which one do we choose? We choose the market to kill our business, or we kill inflation and then bring everything under control and restart, business. That is the way I will look at it.
Dr. Adedipe, as usual, in depth into the first breakdown of this very important topic, and a lot to hold on in your submission. But let me ask you this directly. Do you think this reckons with domestic peculiarities? And that is one. Does it also pose any form of risk to financial intermediation role of banks in the Nigerian economy?
All right, thank you very much. Two important issues raised there. The first one talks about the peculiarity of our environment. The reality is that The peculiarity of our environment says that whenever, as I mentioned earlier on, there is a shift, or let me say a movement, not shift now, a movement in the rate of exchange, every other price in the Nigerian economy reacts to that, whether price of services or of tangible commodities. So in which case, the system is very, very sensitive to the exchange value of the Naira. So if that value keeps changing, then prices will keep changing. But do we advise a reversal of the policy on exchange rate? No, not necessarily. But that the government should reconsider that particular policy of the unified exchange rate and see what changes do we need to make in order for that to lead us into stable exchange rate. And I will go back again on history. I was a part of a survey of the industrial sector in Nigeria way back in 1988. It was when we developed the industrial policy for Nigeria out of the survey. Now, the critical thing, manufacturers all over Nigeria, because I traveled all over. We had different teams, but I was involved in a team that went to the north, covered Lagos, or part of the southeast. And one major thing that ran through all manufacturers then was they were not concerned about the level of the exchange rate, but they were more concerned about the stability, which means it is stable exchange rate that should be of concern to us. So how can these policy changes lead in that direction? We know that when you look at managing exchange rate, liquidity is very central, all right? So if liquidity, the system is awash with liquidity, and it's at two levels. Liquidity in the economy itself, that's the general economy, then liquidity within the banking system, all right? So the way it works is that the central bank will roll out reserve requirements and other, policies that can suck liquidity out of the banking system. Now, the banking system, in response, we also move out to attract more liquidity to the banking system. That's the way it works. So there is a transmission, therefore, of policy, not directly taking money from the public, they're working through the banking system on the one hand. Of course, we may now talk about treasury bills. Very interesting also. If you recall that recently, about 2 months or so ago, the central bank marked up the rate on treasury bills, which again was to go back to what it used to be some 15, 16 years ago. And that is indexing treasury bill rate to the monetary policy rate. So that makes it now attractive as an instrument to invest in. And that will help not only to suck out liquidity from the system, but at the same time make the instrument, which is, by the way, the safest, and also, of course, very, very liquid as well. You can rediscount anytime. So given the combination of those two, it makes it very, very attractive. So that helps to therefore improve liquidity. Reduce liquidity on the one hand, and also tinker interest of foreign investors in that instrument, which of course became open to foreigners in 2017. All right. So put it all together. What that tells you is that we have a situation where we are going in a direction that is also taking account of peculiarities. Now, coming to the banking system, we saw this way back again, as I said, in a memo we issued in our company in September 2023 about where we're likely to end the year 2023 at and what will likely be the direction and expectation for 2024. And we pointed out at the time that given MPR then at 18.75, inflation rate at 24, 25% at the time, that the expectation is that eventually, when the Monetary Policy Committee is constituted, there's a likelihood that there will be an uptick in the MPR. So that is not strange. But when there's an uptick in MPR, it means we call it signal rate to the banking system. It's a signal rate to the banking system. That means the central bank also expects them to make lending rate higher, which is make borrowing more expensive. If you make borrowing expensive, people will borrow less. That's talking about companies and other private borrowers. If that plays out, the worry again will be for the banking system. Loans are now more expensive. What are the chances that that will translate into more non-performing loans for commercial merchant investment banks, or as we call it, PAR in microfinance, and that is portfolio at risk. So now this will likely increase as well. What all of this point to is for manufacturers, You tinker your strategy. How do we respond to this? Okay. For the bankers and other financial institutions, they also have to return to the drawing board and look at their strategy. So what should we do at a time like that? If you expect more loans to go bad for this reason, it means it's a time for banks and other financial institutions to give more attention to debt recovery. Okay? And also what I always tell bankers, you now wear the cap of a consultant, where it is no longer about lending money to a borrower and waiting for the borrower to pay. You become a consultant to that borrower. Which advice and ideas can I give you to make your business thrive in the challenging environment you are? So that if you survive and start making money, then you can pay back what you owe me. So it's about how do we respond to all this? But as we are today, these policies are the hard choices we have to make given the emergency state of the inflationary environment we're operating.
Brilliant. Finally, while I would like to see what you think or like to listen to what you think about the outlook, the GDP for Q4 of 2023 grew at 3.46%, which many said, well, it looks like a step in the right direction. But what sectors are you thinking will drive growth moving on in 2024, Dr. Adedikpe?
Well, thank you so very much. Again, I will go back to the traditional sectors that fall into categories. Those that contribute the most to our GDP on the one hand, and then those that are growing also very fast. I will pick out 7 that have been major contributors to our GDP, and I don't see that changing in 2024. So we'll find there agriculture. Interestingly, manufacturing is there. Okay, of course, trade, ICT, real estate, oil and gas, by the way, it's called mining and quarrying. That's where oil and gas is, mining and quarrying. And of course, financial institution, that is finance, banking, and insurance. Now, the question, if those are the major contributors to our GDP, and I don't expect that to change in 2024, that is a pointer as to where to look at. Now, being in agriculture doesn't necessarily mean you have to be on a farm. It simply says, what are the value chains within that sector? So where are the opportunities for growth that I can take advantage of? Then we now come to those that offer opportunities for growth. And of course, you come back to what are the challenges in the economy today. Or let me put it better, socioeconomic life in Nigeria. Because once you say socioeconomic life, it throws out a lot of opportunities to identify within those challenges. So, of course, a large and growing population certainly needs to be fed, also needs to be housed. Of course, they also need, consumables. But this economy also is rapidly urbanizing on the one hand, but at the same time, digitization is also happening. The Nigerian economy is ascending day by day into a more digital economy. So that immediately puts ICT out, not only as a big contributor to the GDP, but also a growth sector to consider. And if you look carefully recently, the new investments you are seeing in Nigeria are happening in some of these sectors. Perhaps the one I will mention last year is real estate, that many don't pay attention to. But again, if you follow, you are a newsman, okay? You are a media man. You generate the news, you bring it to us. You also notice that recently, there are new foreign investors in some particular subsectors of the real estate sector. So if you look at all of these, what they point out is the fact that the economy has prospect to grow this year, indeed faster than what we had in 2023. If that is the case, then we now say, where will the growth happen? And those are some of the sectors I've mentioned. And then how do I now position myself to be a player in those sectors? So the critical thing, therefore, is if you are in service business, how do I restructure my business on a digital platform that can project us to all our stakeholders end to end? And if I'm also in a non-service business, how can I build a platform where people can access my product and also look at things that are complementary to what I do? In which case, you now look at your business as a service. Okay? So I've veered into strategy, which of course is the final answer we give here. that is the direction everyone who wants to grow and thrive in this economy should go this year.
I must thank you so much, Dr. Biodun Adedikpe. Thank you for starting the week with us on Business Nigeria. Founder, Chief Consultant, B. Adedikpe Associates Limited. Do have a profitable week.
Thank you so very much for having me.